Good morning, everybody. I am very pleased to welcome you today, this morning, to the session on corporate social responsibility regulation, from legal compliance to transformation, organized in collaboration with Oberson Abels. The discussion we're going to have today really goes to the core of one of the debates that's somewhat raging between Europe and Switzerland around ESG and CSR regulation. On the one hand, we've seen that Europe has taken quite a prescriptive approach, heavy-handed, quite heavy in nature, whereas Switzerland has taken quite a different approach around sort of having self-regulation in a way that it's more voluntary. Now, none of them is perfect, and so far the results have been somewhat varying in degrees. And today's discussion is going to really talk about, is there a third way? Can we look at the lessons learned so far from around a year or so in track record around the third way of a fit-for-purpose mechanism that really can push corporates towards transformation? In order to anchor the discussion, we're going to have a keynote by Sonia de la Fuente, who's going to set the scene, the current landscape around regulation, and then we can dive into the discussion. Sonia is an attorney at law from Oberson Abels. She specializes in banking law, employment law. She comes with a decade of experience in legal matters, particularly on sustainable finance. And I'd like to welcome Sonia to the stage. Before that, if the gentlemen can change the slide, I'd like to invite you to take a poll around what your views are on this debate. If you can, that would really help guide the discussion that we're going to have with our panelists today and with Sonia. So if you can take a few minutes to give us your answers, we'd like to see test the pulse of the audience today and see where everyone stands. So I'll give it a few minutes until everybody's given in their answers. It's quite interesting to see this live. We'll keep it secret. Give it a few minutes, a few seconds, let's say, for the last. Would really encourage you to take the poll. So the results are actually quite interesting. They're very varied. What we see is that it's almost divided equally between simplicity and usability, comparability and standardization, and stakeholder accountability, with very few of you thinking about the enforcement mechanisms. I think there is no right and wrong answer here, but really this could guide the debate right now for our panelists. And Sonia, I'd like to invite you to the stage, so perhaps we'll welcome Sonia.
Thank you, Zina. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Before turning to our panel discussion for a deep dive into the limits and the opportunities and also challenges of current and future CSR regulations, I'd like to start by setting the scene with an overview of the current landscape. And I will close this short presentation by revisiting with you the result of the poll you just took. So it's not just for animation or entertainment. In April 2013, the Rana Plaza building collapsed in Bangladesh, killing more than 1,100 garment workers. The building housed factories producing fashion items for major European and American brands. This disaster called into question the reputation of these international companies. It was also a wake-up call that accountability cannot stop at the company's front door. It must extend across the entire supply chain. CSR regulations have increased significantly in the past 15 years, and the question that one should keep in mind is probably, could today's CSR regulations have prevented the Rana Plaza disaster? But first, let's now look at how regulations are shaping the field. In a nutshell, most CSR frameworks are today built around two core ideas. First, disclosure, which requires companies to publish detailed sustainability reports. Second, due diligence, which ensure companies was purpose is to ensure that companies take responsibility for risk and impact across their supply chain. Here you have two examples. One is the Swiss regulatory framework, and the second one, the European, the EU regulatory framework. In Switzerland, the legal framework includes non-financial reporting for large companies. It also provides for mandatory requirements of due diligence in the supply chain in specific areas or for only particular industries, namely extracting companies. In the EU, we have a larger set of rules, and two of the most of the core directives or set of rules are first the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which requires detailed disclosures on how companies are impacted by sustainability risks, and equally how their own activities impact people and the environment, what is called double materiality. As for the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, so the second one you have on the, well, there, it obliges large companies to monitor and address risks along the entire value chain. The purpose of these regulations is about building trust among stakeholders, namely shareholders, investors, regulators, the civil society at large, financial institutions as well. It's also to manage risk and ensure companies' accountability for social and environmental impacts. When put into actions, these regulations translate first into detailed sustainability reports, which comply with recognized standards. Regarding due diligence requirements, many or different tools or different actions can be taken. What we can typically see on the field is on-ground verifications by independent auditors, or also binding due diligence clauses in supplier and business partners' contracts. The implementation of these laws also means investing internally through policies, staff training, and ongoing education about sustainability. That said, these laws, especially for CSR reporting regulations, are often criticized for focusing too heavily on process rather than substance. This raises the question, do these laws truly drive change or just more paperwork? And actually, the current regulatory mood around CSR is shifting. In the EU, the early push for ambitious ESG frameworks is now giving way to concerns about over-regulation and a loss of competitiveness. As a result, the recent EU Omnibus package signals a shift toward simplification and even partial deregulation, given that the scope of typically the CSRD or the Directive on Sustainability Due Diligence will be significantly reduced. So, in other words, fewer companies in the future will be subject to these regulations. In Switzerland, momentum is slowing as well. Earlier this year, the Swiss Federal Council announced that further legislative revisions on CSR are put on hold pending the outcome of the EU review. And in the United States, as you are probably aware of, we see even a more radical approach. For example, the proposed Protect USA Act would actually prohibit US firms from complying with foreign ESG laws. So American, a US company that has a significant activity or has a presence in the EU that would be subject, provided that they fell into the scope of applicability of these laws, that would be subject to this, let's say, the directive on due diligence, on sustainability due diligence. Based on this Protect USA Act, these companies will be prohibited to comply with these EU regulations. To a large extent, this rollback is driven by economic concerns and competitive pressures. And as we approach the end of this presentation, let's circle back to our opening audience poll. But first, just a preliminary comment. As a core principle, effective regulation, should it be CSR regulation or regulation at large, requires to be clear, proportionate, and enforceable. But effectiveness also depends on another criteria or condition, which is engagement. Not only from the companies which are subject to these mandatory requirements, but from all stakeholders. As I said, shareholders, investors, financial institutions, consumers, suppliers, or regulators. In other words, companies and their constituencies need to acknowledge to some extent that these CSR frameworks make sense and are actually useful, which today seems not to be the case because many companies challenge the usefulness of these activities, of these laws, and we see that legislators are also rolling back on these regulations. Engagement by the companies can typically be imposed through stronger enforcement mechanisms. But as I see on the poll, that's not the preferred option. When we think about enforcement mechanisms, we will often think about action in court, about penalties, this kind of tools. Simpler and more practical regulations can also foster stronger engagement from the companies subject to mandatory CSR requirements. And based on this poll, we see that this is one of the approaches that would be preferred, for instance, for this audience. And it makes probably a lot of sense. At least in the EU, we have reached a point where the regulations are very complicated to navigate. In fact, I think it has almost become an obvious question. And even if we can argue whether that's true or not, or even if that's a necessary process and it has to get worse before it gets better, the point is that companies, the entities that are subject to these regulations, do not engage, do not adhere to these rules, and that's simply put, it's a challenge for the implementation. But engagement can also be encouraged by creative incentives for companies to integrate CSR into their business strategy. Someone once told me companies don't have values, they have their customers' values or their client values. Well, that may be up for debate, so I won't open this debate here, but it does highlight that if companies see an economic or a strategic interest in CSR, they will buy in more easily. This is where enhanced stakeholder accountability becomes critical. And it's very interesting because based on this audience poll, we see that simple rules could be a tool or should be a top priority, but also stakeholder accountability. In other words, the more investor, consumer, and civil society at large demand responsibility and are empowered to do so, the more companies are likely to embed CSR into their core business strategy. Empowering these stakeholders may be achieved through enhanced enforcement mechanisms, that's like the level 1 of compliance, typically through legal actions, but also clearer rules that may allow stakeholders to compare data, to better understand the data made available to them by companies, can help stakeholders, let's say investors, consumers, to make an informed decision on the CSR results of companies and maybe choose one company over another. I don't pretend to offer here the perfect recipe or a recipe for transformative CSR regulations. Rather, I would conclude that each of the priorities suggested in the poll is relevant and have the potential to create an incremental impact. Taken together, these aspects are likely to accelerate a change of mindset, which may move us beyond mere compliance. Thank you for your attention. And without further ado, let's now hear directly from our panel of experts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonia. I think you've given the panel quite a bit to think about, to debate. So I'm so pleased to introduce our panelists today. They bring quite a bit different views around CSR regulation from an issuer's perspective, from legal perspective, from an academic's perspective, and most importantly these days from an investor's perspective. With us we have Melanie Larkin. Melanie is the Chief Senior Sustainability Manager at Pictet Group. She supports and drives strategic partnerships and supports the group's responsible investing strategy. We have Professor Dominic Ronan. He's a professor of economics at the Geneva Graduate Institute. He holds the Andre Hoffman Chair in Political Economics and Governance, and also is the co-director of the Hoffman Center for Sustainability. We have with us Dominic Habiger. So, we have two Dominics today, so I'll call Professor and Dominic. Dominic Habiger is the Chief Sustainability. No offense. Just for like. Dominic is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Deputy Pictet et Turritini and is a pioneer in ESG investing since the 1990s. He actually was the co-founder of one of the first ESG platforms and currently serves on the board of Sustainable Finance Geneva. We have Anthony Gloor with us, who's the Deputy CEO of Ethos Foundation, where he oversees compliance, technology, and the operations of Ethos Foundation. He has a background in risk management and also lectures at the Geneva School of Business Administration. And finally, we have Antoine Amiguet. Antoine is one of the founding members of Obersten Abels. He brings with him more than 20 years of experience advising clients on finance, banking, asset management, and data protection. He often publishes and lectures on matters related to sustainable finance. So with this, I'd like to quickly sort of dive into the topic at hand and perhaps start with you, Melanie, as from Pictet Group, who's recently issued their sustainability report. How hard has this been? How burdensome, if any? And I think more pointedly, has this changed anything operationally for Pictet Group in terms of engaging with its stakeholders and also around resource allocation?
Absolutely, thank you. So first I'll caveat that I am by no means a regulatory expert. I'm here as someone who has been through the reporting process. We reported in compliance with the CSRD for the first time this year on a voluntary basis, maybe masochistically, but lived through it. And I would say just in being careful about and deliberate about wording, I would say for any company with a complex supply or value chain, the process is very resource intensive. I mean, you're collating data inputs that come from, for example, our investments, overlaying their, for example, scope 3 emissions with our internal financial systems to then gauge what our final footprint is. And then on the operations side, we have hundreds and hundreds of data points that we're contending with coming from across jurisdictions. I mean, think about like translating a Japanese utility bill and then making that into something that is coherent that we can then put into our outputs and have a broad overview of in relation to all of our other operational emissions. So from that perspective, it's highly resource intensive. That whole process could also be very costly if it's something we want to automate. Otherwise, it's very manual, which then, of course, always leaves us vulnerable to errors. And at the end of the day, it all then needs to be robust enough to be audited. So from those perspectives, yes, it is a highly resource-intensive exercise. And in terms of how it has then influenced our processes internally, I'd say at the advisory board level, there's definitely more ownership now on the sustainability topics in terms of both our dependencies and our impacts, and greater familiarity with where that materiality lies, of course, through the very nature of the disclosure requirements. I'd say there's also greater integration with our finance teams internally, because they've had to be involved, of course, in how we translate all of this into where our financed emissions are, for example. And then finally, in terms of engagement, we have a strong engagement policy with our investee companies that goes back through our strategy over decades. But this exercise definitely helps to both inform and reinforce where we emphasize those engagement efforts. And then, of course, on the operations side, that opens up a whole avenue of engagement potential with our suppliers, and that's across jurisdictions. And you can't start to have conversations unless you're aware of what is even happening. You can't make a budget if you don't know what is going out and where it's going. So that's been, even though highly resource intensive, it has been very informative, and it has already started to shape and direct internal processes as well.
Thanks, Melanie. I think that really sets the scene now. Pictet Group did this on a voluntary basis. A lot of the other companies are actually required to report. Now, Antoine, from a legal perspective, do you feel that companies are clear on what's expected of them? Can you speak a little bit about what's been sort of the most legal uncertainty, or perhaps maybe even what are the unnecessary complexities in these regulations?
That's a very interesting question. No, it really depends on the region, as we understand that in the EU and in Switzerland, the approaches are really different. So in the EU, rules are generally clear, I would say even too clear, in the sense that they are very, very detailed. And the real challenge in the EU is less a question of lack of expectations, but rather about complexity and the pace of change. So companies in the EU are overwhelmed by details, by shifting timelines, and also by the way different pieces of legislation are interacting. And Switzerland is quite the opposite. The approach is lighter, it's principle-based, and it's less prescriptive. But that flexibility in Switzerland has, of course, its benefits, but it also sometimes leaves the companies with uncertainty on what is really enough. And in Switzerland, there is a second challenge for companies, I would say, because they have to comply with two sets of regulations. So they have to comply with the Swiss rules for their local activities and with EU regulation for anything that touches the EU market. And of course, one way to manage this is to turn to the EU regulation, either by taking that as a reference point or by adopting them outright. But EU rules, as we understand, are very, very demanding, and not every Swiss company will want to or need to comply with these rules. So in the end, for Swiss companies, it's really a question of it's a case-by-case decision, and it will really depend on the size of the company, on its sector of activity, and on whether they have an exposure to the EU market.
Thank you, Antoine. So I think that really sets the scene of what's really happening right now, before we sort of look at a sort of a forward-looking of maybe what the third way could look like. Professor Ronan, perhaps maybe we can pivot a little bit to give a bit of more data-based conclusion around how transparency and sort of these mechanisms around transparency have really translated into impact. And I call impact good or bad around sometimes it could backfire into really cosmetic type of transparency mechanisms. Can you speak, based on the research? We know that you've worked quite a bit on the sort of extractive industries, but perhaps maybe make a conclusion around what's been sort of the correlation between transparency and impact.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So basically, there is this notion that it's all hot air, right? It's greenwashing, it's kind of just red tape, it's kind of firms wasting their time, etc. So this notion you see a lot, especially from some political forces. Now the question is, well, is this the case, or does it make a real world difference? That's exactly what you're asking about. And of course the question is tricky to answer, but I'll talk about one or two examples from big statistical studies that we've done. So one study I'll talk about is called This Mine is Mine, published in American Economic Review a few years ago. And so what we do there in that study is we take the whole continent of Africa, and we cut the continent into little cells, 50 times 50 kilometer cells, and we look whether there are mines in these cells. So each one of you here in the room may be a cell, and you as well. And so let's suppose that Antoine is a silver cell, and Melanie is a gold cell, and Sina is a platinum cell, right? And so. And Dominique may be a lithium cell, right? And so what you have is that basically what we then exploit, we know where the mines are all around Africa, and then we exploit price shocks. And price shocks that are not driven by Africa, but they're driven by us buying a new iPhone, for example, or new batteries. So the Tesla comes on the market, lithium cells become now really important. If you have a lithium mine in your location, somewhere next to Nairobi, you have a lithium cell. Well, what you see is that you have a huge spike in conflict, in armed conflict, rebels trying to take over a cell, a given mine, near a lithium mine when there is a lithium price boom. And the same if there's a platinum boom, well then Sina's mine will be attacked. Now the important thing, why do I tell this? It's like, again, the professor talk about random stuff. No, why do I tell this? Well, In the second part of this paper, then we look at CSR and traceability. And what we see is that if you're in a world where firms behave very badly, they don't care about social responsibility, there is no transparency about supply chains of critical minerals, in these kind of places, conflict goes up by a quarter. So basically, price spikes in critical minerals would explain a quarter of wars in Africa. It's a huge number, right? However, in places, in given locations where you have a mine covered by the Kimberley Protocol or by other traceability initiatives, and or when the firms extracting there are kind of bound to CSR principles, well, what you see is that the effect goes down to nearly zero. So basically, we can, by having reasonable rules of CSR and traceability, we can cut a quarter of conflicts in Africa in quite a simple way. So in this study, we find a really clear-cut, proven impact in the real world on people's lives.
Maybe the causality is the other way around.
Well, so the causality, the thing, what we exploit, because economists have a lot of, we have a lot of failures. However, we are obsessed with causality. So the reason we can see this as causal and not causality the other way around is that we exploit price shocks. It's actually it's us buying the new iPhone when it comes up in the market that will increase the price of this metal and that metal, and it's not so it's not the local consumption of iPhones in Uganda that does the job, because most iPhones are sold in New York or Geneva. So that's why otherwise it's a very tricky question. So that's why we were so happy to come up with this statistical trick.
Thank you, Professor. And I think, for the extractive industries, it's quite apparent, and perhaps, most of people are interested to see that correlation because of sort of the turbulence around sourcing. Now, if we take all of what we have and now take the perspective from an investor's perspective, or how do we actually consume this kind of information? And there's a lot of information, as we said. Melanie spoke about sort of the heaviness of producing these reports. Dominic, are these reports actually being consumed? Do people read them to make any kind of informed decision around investments?
Well, first of all, let me try to answer this question as a proud practitioner. I'm not a professor, but I think we're very complementary, and I'd love to follow up on the lithium supply chain issues and how it impacts peace and stability, so that we don't replicate with the critical minerals what we did with oil. But that's not the topic of the day. So if we come back to the regulation, how it impacts my daily job, I'll try to have a nuanced answer, but it's important to understand my context. I've been working 15 years with ESG data, and probably much more the last 15 years with engagement and stewardship, so less focused on the data per se, but how you can influence them. And my context also is a context of a mainstream investor. And if the regulation doesn't help mainstream investor to be more effective in their job, because we also work under increased constraint to add value, and our clients to 90%, 80% do not require me to save the world and the planet. They require us to provide risk-adjusted returns. Okay, we have 10, 15, 20% of clients that really want sustainability, and they really want to see that we do what they ask for. So the regulation, to be honest, it's not CSRD a big revolution. I mean, it did not really change a lot on my daily work. So it's been designed for sustainable finance 1.0, for the data world, for the rating agencies to get access to standardized data. And that's working well. But we need, as a community, move beyond. And now, how can we leverage on these reports, on these data that are provided to us, to better engage with our portfolio companies and actually focus on how they will improve, how they will transition, how they will be able to answer what is material to me, but not to me as a Chief Sustainability Officer, but to our team, to the portfolio manager that take investment decision. So there is two stakeholders to convince. There is the companies to progress, and there is the portfolio managers that we work with in order to integrate this information into day-to-day investment decision. The biggest challenge is to convince them that there is material information, that there are material risks, that the companies are now providing information to, and some companies are doing a better job than others. And this is not yet a given. And we've seen, and I will come back to that in the second part of the panel, that to some extent, companies have a little bit used the regulation to transform their informative ESG report into a compliance exercise. And that's bad news. But we as investors can shape that, we can drive it. It will depend to some extent on how much Brussels trusts us, that we will do our work, we will do our part, because those reports were a lot designed for us, to now help tell companies from our inverse perspective what is truly material, so that they continue to focus on this and provide more information, forward-looking information.
Thank you, Dominic. But so then there's like a fine line between box ticking and really actually using the regulation in order to push operations forward, to improve, to sort of really take matters of materiality more internally and look at the operations. So I guess maybe Anthony from Ethos Foundation, can you speak to the extent of, has this data been helpful to engage with companies on actually moving forward? And I speak moving forward, maybe improving their operations, or do you see that because of the heaviness, or they move into just a compliance sort of box ticking exercise, get it over with year on year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from an investor perspective, and especially investor that's not only focused on financial performance, these frameworks bring a lot of transparency, bring metrics, bring comparability to the investors. So all these data are actually is a gold mine for investors to look in, to compare, to find out who are laggards, who are in front of the ball, and so on. And I think when we talk to companies that are reluctant regarding all these items, we mention one point, which is you cannot manage what you do not measure. And I think that's something that's very important, and it also leads to accountability, and this is where this whole stewardship activity comes in. Us as investors, we can actually push accountability to the board. We can press the board to actually own these risks that are identified in those kind of reports, like climate risks, social risks, human rights risks. And then they can be the starting point of defining a strategy, which as investors and shareholders, we have to validate these strategies, thinking typically about the climate strategies that have now emerged following these different requirements. And as shareholders, you have to validate this. You have to have a say on pay and link this to performance, financial performance and non-financial performance. So that's where the stewardship comes in and brings value to the process. And it's not just about compliance.
Well, I mean, that's a big job to get to convince companies to typically link pay to these kinds of things. We probably haven't seen so many good case studies around that, but I think we can talk about that a bit further. So, I mean, this is the context so far, right? And now our idea is to kind of not backward look, but forward look, right? And there's the Omnibus package right now. Switzerland's on hold. There is an opportunity to really improve and to think about how do each of sort of your respective institutions and industries, so to speak, can influence the change, right? So maybe we start from a legal perspective. If we were to think forward, what do we actually need? Better rules, better enforcement? I know we spoke about the poll, and Sonia had spoken around certain things around enforceability, but from a legal point of view and seeing your clients, what is it that what is needed that can really improve the current status?
So I would basically highlight three areas. And the first one, it relates rather to the European legislation, is proportionality. So for many companies, small and medium-sized companies, and also for Swiss companies, which are non-EU companies with activity in the EU, the EU regulation feel really heavy and difficult to follow. So maybe the first thing is to have rules that are proportionate to the company's size and to their actual risk exposure. So that would be the first area. The second one, and it relates more about the Swiss law, is alignment. So Swiss law does not need to copy word for word the EU regulation, but it should be more Euro-compatible. And this would really decrease the duplicity, duplication, and improve also the comparability. And that's very important also in an open world that we know today. And last but not least is substance over process. So regulation should really focus on making sure that reporting and due diligence will actually change corporate behavior, and rather, as we said, than just adding more box ticking.
Thank you, Antoine. Proportionality, alignment, and basically substance over process, right? So if we turn it, Melanie, and maybe it's too much to speak around all of industry, but given Pictet Group has voluntarily decided to actually do this exercise, forward-looking, looking at the both sides of the coin, what would you need as an issuing entity, so to speak, that would help improve the process internally and also not make it so heavy, burdensome? So what would you perhaps ask from the process of change?
So I think there's the external and internal perspective. So externally, I think what we really need is stability, right? If we're going to have a robust reporting and prescriptive disclosures framework, then we need to clearly invest in the resources to report against them. And in order to make those investments, we need to know that this is going to still be needed in the same way year after year. Of course, with room for improvement on the margins, but largely, following the same prescription. So that stability is essential. And then the other thing that I think in terms of making it effective, two other things from external again would be having it audited, because studies have shown that this is really what does drive internal change. And then finally, I think on the double materiality process, I think that we can move towards something that is a bit less subjective and a bit more objective in terms of how these are determined company by company, because this is really what enables us to focus on what matters at the end of the day. All is well and good if we report across all these metrics, but don't capture what is actually material, both in terms of dependencies and impact. Internally, I think what really helps enable this is governance, process, and purpose. So governance, having clear ownership at the board level and focus on what is material. Process, having integrated flows of information that can go directly real time into our internal systems, so that we can have this continuous check and validation of what we are exposed to. And then finally, purpose, that we have business relevant metrics that can help inform target setting and strategic decision making on the issues that are most material, both for ourselves as a business, our investments, and towards advancing the sustainable transition.
Thank you, Melanie. So basically, there's a lot of responsibility and onus on the organization as well, right? Taking it on in a serious matter, but the ask is to have also some view as to the next 5 to 10 years, that it's not going to get an overhaul every couple of years. So when we look at designing and improving these, I think Professor Dominic, could you speak perhaps from the research, not only on extractive industries, but perhaps some of the other industries that you've looked at? What kind of mechanisms of transparency that have really contributed to change in behavior?
Yeah, so basically we have another study where basically we look at the impact of all multinationals, again, at the whole continent level and for different industries. What we see is that for a variety of environmental outcomes, when it comes to fine particle pollution, deforestation, all kind of crop diversity, biodiversity measures, if we look at all these different dimensions across whole continent, Africa, again with our data, what we see is that, well, basically, in general, one thing that's really important is the interaction between international legislation and local legislation. Because, I mean, what we see in our data is a very strong effect of pollution haven. So the kind of, in general, the industries that are most to blame in terms of bad economic environmental outcomes are typically the first and second sector. So we're talking about, you know, mining, forestry, and industry, while services are kind of, you know, on the positive side in general. But that's not very surprising. But what we found very striking is really this pollution haven story, where if you have a Swiss company or a Canadian company coming from a country with very strong environmental regulations, well, they have a tendency to dislocate in places with very lax rules. And we've seen it, I mean, this has been claimed by people for a long time, but we have been able to show it in the data. And for me, what this means is that we need to kind of harmonize at the multilateral level. So I think this also speaks to the differences Antoine was talking about between Switzerland and EU. If, I mean, your job, Melanie, would be much easier if the Swiss rules and the EU rules were the same, for example. And so, and that's a very general point. I mean, as long as there are places with laxer rules, it's kind of the weak link in some sense in terms of institutional rules. So we need kind of a global approach where we work together, and so we need to strengthen multilateralism, despite the fact that unfortunately, well, it's not going in that direction these days. But I mean, clearly that's the only way to go. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, but I think maybe we're asking the impossible of getting everybody to agree, and there's always the lowest common denominator that people will go to the easiest way. Somehow it feels like there's a real role for investors to sort of engage. And so we spoke about a lot of stewardship. And Anthony, I think it would be great to kind of get maybe some case study or some concrete example around Ethos Foundation's work with companies as to how do you engage with them? You know, you speak about pay, you speak about ownership from the board, you speak about sort of helping them really take on. Can we speak about sort of, maybe without naming names, the more difficult aspects of that stewardship activity?
Well, I'm happy to name. Don't worry. No, we're quite transparent about our activities, and if you want a concrete example of the whole stewardship and how it pushed better compliance and better processes and transparency, I'll take the example of Holcim's recent spin-off of their US activities with Amrise. So a few months ago, they listed this new company. We were discussing with them since quite a while as responsible investors. And while it makes absolute perfect sense from a business perspective, we had concerns as a responsible investor that this might hinder the whole climate ambitions. So Holcim had an objective to be net zero by 2050. How would that work with Amrise, the new company? Would they be carved out of these objectives? We had concerns about the governance of the new company, where there would be The CEO would actually be the chairman. So we had engaged the company or the companies to set our conditions, to define what we were asking to this company, mainly keeping transparency, keeping the ambition towards the strategy, sustainable strategy. And after receiving some guarantees, we actually approved or recommended approving the spin-off at the general meeting in last April.
That was Ethos' Foundation's doing it alone, or you were with other, I would assume, with the other, is there sort of a concerted effort from the investor point of view to engage on that front?
In this case, we were representing mostly Swiss investors, so pension funds. This is a case where, given it's a Swiss company, we tend to be the lead organization in these kind of activities. On more international or non-Swiss companies, we either get together with coalitions as well. We mentioned the Rana Plaza, but there was a lot of activities that were consequences of this Rana Plaza during 10 years. The Accord, that was how it was called, where we joined these kind of coalitions to be able to voice our concerns together. We are still kind of a small investor in Switzerland, so we are well known in Switzerland, but it's getting together and being able to voice our concerns.
Thank you. And Dominic, I mean, if we take also the flip side of this around sort of the role of the investor to shape the next iteration, in your experience, what's making sort of the disclosures comparable? Ultimately, the idea, when we were discussing, this is also for the benefit of investors in addition. So if we were to look at the next iteration, how would we look at sort of getting these decision useful comparabilities around the regulation?
I will give very tangible examples to highlight the challenge and how we could get the best out of what we have now. First of all, of course, we can regret that we are here now with a situation, as I said earlier, that hasn't really changed much compared to 5 or 10 years ago in terms of data I get for the companies I analyze. There is not a revolution, but we are in a situation where there has been probably one of the biggest political mistakes around sustainability, a lot of lack of credibility now, a lot of companies that were ready to go ahead with this. Now they see, okay, it has been too fast, too uncoordinated, too top-down, and it should have been, of course, done more bottom-up, a little bit slower, the Swiss way to engage with the companies, the leading companies, and then maybe trickle down progressively the regulation to smaller companies. This has not been done. It's been today seen as a big mistake. So tangibly for me, if I analyze companies, what I'm seeing now, I see companies, more and more companies, lately I looked at Siemens, it was the case, they do a dual structure reporting. They're gonna do a CSRD compliant report, strictly complying to the regulation, and they do a web page, a new sustainability report, separate. So I have 2 reports to read. Is this going to help my colleagues from financial departments to read more information about sustainability? I don't think so. So this is a problem that I see emerging, that we're going to have the compliance part and the rest of the information. And we as a financial community, if we ask companies what we see material, example of Siemens. Siemens did that, and so the information on the human rights issues in their supply chain, okay, this is not CSRD, this is in my sustainability report. So, mining, we're going back. If we address and we say, for me, the resilience of your supply chain is the most material issue. Why? Because you're doing a very good job on the other issues that are mandatory. So now the material gap, the difference between what is material and what is unmanaged, from a financial perspective, that's unremunerated risk. I'm not paid not to take risks. I just need to be paid to understand and to be paid for the risk I'm taking. So there is a gap. And then the other little or big issue I see is in the key component of CSRD, which is the double materiality analysis. It seems to be a little bit of an exercise that also is not really driven by the company's operations, where they're located and their supply chains. It's very much done with stakeholders. I have many companies asking me to be a stakeholder on their double materiality analysis. And I say, don't do that. You have to go and ask the companies in Nigeria, in Uganda, your supply chain there, what is material to them? What could make a risk not to be able to supply? Because it's water, it's lack of energy, child labor, and in every location, you're gonna see it's different. And you end up with a materiality matrix where you see, oh, human right is 2.5, social, and okay, that maybe matches nowhere. Because in Italy, it's going to be completely different, in Switzerland, it's going to be different, and different in the Asian operations. So it can be an oreiller de paresse, I don't know how to translate that in English, to do this consolidated exercise, this is material and not material, without seeing that there could be a very big issue happening fundamentally in one small part of the supply chain. And we have seen so many of these cases recently hitting our portfolio companies. So this is dangerous. And but we, and on a positive note, as investors, we can shape it. And it's not forbidden in the regulations for company to say information which is not on top of their materiality matrix. But the companies we have talked about that, they say, yes, it's our auditors that said not to write anything which is not on top of our materiality matrix. So we also need to educate auditors now so that we don't have 2 or 3 different reports. It's not impossible, it's not forbidden by law to write in your CSRD report, okay, this is not part of my required audited information, but I think it's relevant for investors to know.
Thank you, but yeah, I mean, you're asking companies perhaps to go the extra mile, maybe they don't. I mean, from the discussion today, there's opportunity. There's definitely opportunity. There's a starting point. There, you know, we hear frustration from many companies, also from sort of the legal. So if we were to say, you know, we don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater, there's a good base. So if there was one thing that you would definitely take out, or one thing that you would definitely keep, why either or sort of a fire sort of round from each of you around what's existing and that you could build on. Maybe we can end on a positive note, but also, you know, looking at the opportunity going forward. So maybe I start with you, Antoine, if we look forward.
So there would be many things I would change, but the one thing I would keep is the EU's ambition. So I think that now the challenge regarding regulation is to simplify without losing that ambition.
Thank you. Anthony.
I was actually going to say the same thing. Ambition, but also the momentum. I think there's a lot of things that need to be revamped. Simplification, usability, we mentioned it. But I think we need to keep the pace currently.
Thank you. Melanie.
I think what can be improved upon is the materiality assessment process. Materiality is so critical in terms of guiding focus if we're going to be successful in this transition. But we definitely need to improve upon how that is done, and I don't know how to do that at this point. But the other part that I would keep would be the audit. I think we need to have objective external auditors, and that also, they need improvement. I mean, it's new for them as well. We probably also need to expand who we go to for the audits as well, and open that up for consideration. But I think that's critical in terms of keeping us and our companies honest.
Dominic.
I hope we're going to have a more agile, modular, bottom-up based regulation. I mean that less giving top-down instruction that you need to report, that you don't need to report, but that kind of trust the wisdom of the crowd, of the people that will do the effort to read the reports and try to tell them, okay, this is nice information, but this is lacking, to give more trust to the key stakeholder for this regulation to be designed, the investors, to have a more leverage to shape it. And that's not so clear yet if we're going to get there. And I hope this will happen.
Professor.
Yeah, more stepping up multilaterally driven transparency, traceability protocols and initiatives. I think that would help.
Thank you. So we see that the onus is on each of you, essentially, to take an active sort of role in shaping this. So collectively, there's a bit of the laissez-faire attitude from Switzerland to kind of keep it agile, but keep the ambition, substance over process, but also, make sure that there's audited, there's the materiality around it, not to lose the essence of what's really working right now without making companies sort of so bogged down in box ticking that we end up becoming more process oriented than substance. So with this, I hope this has given you a lot of food for thought. There's definitely opportunity to make the laws better, the regulation better, get Switzerland maybe to up the ante a little bit and join EU's ambition around something that's more aligned. And I hope you've enjoyed this panel. And I want to thank you all for this very, very interactive discussion. And thank you, Sonia, for the keynote. And I wish you all a good afternoon then.